Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something a little strange. The kind of slow burn mystery you could almost mistake for a dream if you weren't listening closely. You find yourself standing in a dim, dusty study, the kind that smell faintly of old paper and ink, where the air seems a little thicker than it should be. The desk in front of you is wide and heavy, its corners nicked from decades of elbows and coffee cups. There's a low desk lamp casting a golden cone of light, but it doesn't seem to push back much of the gloom. You spot scattered papers, but they aren't white. They've yellowed into a soft tea-stained hue, and every single line of handwriting on them is in blue ink. Not a single stroke of black anywhere. It's such a small detail, almost petty in its consistency, but it catches you. You lean forward. The blue is deep, almost regal. Not the cheap, bright blue of a school pen, but something slower, heavier. And it's everywhere. On forged letters, on fake receipts, even on the margins where someone doodled small curls and loops, almost absent-mindedly. It makes you think. Either this person really loved a particular pen, or there was something else at play. You might not make it out of this one without asking yourself far too many questions about ink colors. And yes, that's somehow the whole point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The desk drawer slides open with a lazy resistance, and you find more of the same. Papers, blue ink, and that faint smell of something between metal and almonds. You run your fingers over the top sheet. The writing is smooth, deliberate, almost too neat. You've seen forged handwriting before in documentaries or crime photos, but there's usually something tense about it, a stiffness where the forger is forcing their hand. Not here. Whoever wrote this was relaxed, maybe even enjoying themselves. That detail matters. A calm forger is dangerous. It means they're not just skilled, but comfortable. Like a pianist who doesn't think about the notes anymore. It's all muscle memory. And here's your first soft psychological nudge. When people repeat the same small choice over years, like preferring one ink color, it often becomes part of their identity. They might even forget they're doing it. Which begs the question, was the blue ink habit conscious, or was it just them? The smell of the room is strange. You notice a bottle on the shelf. Not cologne, not perfume, but an old inkwell. The label is faded, but you can still make out Royal Blue number 12. This isn't something you'd find in a grocery store aisle. This is specialty ink, the kind clerks used before fountain pens went out of style. You hold the bottle up, and a faint shimmer runs through it under the lamp, like liquid velvet. You can almost hear the scratch of a nib across paper, steady and unhurried. There's a rhythm to it, long downward strokes, short flicks, then a pause. You picture a man, maybe in his 40s when he started, glasses perched low, a cigarette smoldering in an ashtray while he worked. His handwriting isn't just forgery, it's a performance. And the blue ink, it's the stage lighting. There's a small blotter on the desk. You pick it up and see faint reversed impressions of words pressed into the pad. Phrases like certificate of authenticity and transfer of ownership. These are not random scribbles. They're the building blocks of big, official-looking lies. And there, again, in every impression, the slant of letters that seems to glow when written in blue. It's almost hypnotic, the way your eyes adjust to it. You think about how blue is perceived, trustworthy, professional, even soothing. Banks used to use it deliberately to project stability. Doctors signed prescriptions in it so they'd be easily distinguished from photocopies. In the forger's hands, those associations become camouflage. People's brains see blue and relax, and that's when the lie slips in. You lean back in the creaky leather chair, letting the thoughts settle. Maybe you're imagining it, but the ink seems more than a preference. It's a shield, an alibi built into the color itself, a criminal's magic trick hidden in plain sight. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a small question flickers. Did the forger choose blue because of its psychological edge, or did the psychological edge come later, justified after the fact? Experts still argue about this kind of thing. Was it deliberate strategy, or just a quirk that accidentally worked in their favor? A soft breeze pushes through the half-open window, carrying the scent of rain on pavement. It ruffles a stack of envelopes, each stamped but never sent. You notice they're all addressed to different banks, different companies, different names. And all the addresses are slightly wrong. The handwriting is the same, the blue ink the same, but the street numbers are off by a digit or two. Decoys, maybe. A distraction. You rest your hand on the desk, feeling the grooves carved into the wood over years of use. There's a chipped teacup near the lamp with a small ring of blue at its base. Not paint, but a dried spill from a pen rinsing ritual. You picture the forger dipping a nib into warm water, swirling out the remnants of one masterpiece before starting another. There's something almost tender about the image, and yet you can't shake the weight of it. Every neat letter in blue ink might have been the key to stealing a life's savings, a property deed, a piece of someone's identity. The calmness of the study, the orderliness of the desk, it all contrasts with the quiet chaos such forgeries must have caused. That's the strange duality of crimes like this. The scene of creation is peaceful, but the ripple effect is anything but. You glance once more at the royal blue bottle. The cap is slightly loose, and when you pick it up again, your fingers come away stained. You can't resist rubbing your thumb and forefinger together, feeling the slickness before it dries into a faint, powdery residue. In that moment, you imagine every document this ink ever touched. Contracts that were never real, signatures that belonged to no one, histories rewritten without consent. The room feels quieter now, as if it's holding its breath. You stand, the floorboards creaking softly beneath you, and let your eyes sweep across the shadows. The desk, the bottle, the papers. They're pieces of a puzzle you've only just started fitting together. And in the center of it all, an unassuming shade of blue that somehow feels heavier than black ever could. You step away from the desk, but the color clings to your thoughts. That deep, steady blue, it follows you as you move toward the back of the study. A narrow hallway opens up, walls lined with crooked picture frames. Some are sepia portraits of unsmiling people in stiff suits. Others are newer, though still decades old, showing the same desk, the same room, but cleaner. In one photo, a man sits behind the desk with a fountain pen in hand, mid-stroke. You can't see the ink in the black and white image, but somehow you know. The hallway leads to a smaller room, almost an afterthought in the house's layout. Inside is another desk, this one far more modest. A single bare bulb hangs overhead, and the light sways faintly as if someone's just passed by. The air smells faintly of dust and rusted metal. There's a single document in the center of the desk, a bank form, the kind where boxes are meant to be filled out in careful, blocky letters. You lean in. The handwriting here is different from the smooth, thought-flowing lines you saw earlier. It's awkward, hesitant, as if the writer was mimicking a style they hadn't yet mastered. Still, the ink is the same shade of blue. The first forgery. You picture it happening in real time. The forger hunched over this very desk, chewing the inside of their cheek, trying to get the curve of a G just right. The pen must have paused often, leaving tiny dots where the tip rested too long. You notice them here, little flecks of ink where the paper fibers swelled like tiny bruises. There's a psychological concept that fits perfectly here, the illusion of competence. Early in a criminal career, there's often a period where mistakes are made, but the person convinces themselves they're already skilled enough to get away with it. The first forgery carries that overconfidence like a watermark. You trace your finger along the line where a fake account number is written. The spacing is slightly uneven, but not enough to jump out at an untrained eye. You think about how many documents you've skimmed in your life without really seeing them. The human brain is wired to look for the gist, not the detail. That's the forger's opening. A quirky fact bubbles up from somewhere in your memory. During the mid-20th century, many banks actually preferred blue ink for customer signatures because it was easier to distinguish from black ink photocopies. In other words, this forger didn't just choose a color they liked. They were choosing one that institutions already trusted. It's like robbing a bank while wearing the bank's own uniform. On the desk beside the document sits a chipped coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" faded almost to white. You pick it up, wondering if the forger actually was a father, or if it was just another piece of camouflage, a prop to soften their image in case anyone ever came knocking. You sit in the chair and try to imagine the first time this forgery passed into someone else's hands. Maybe it was a bank clerk in a cramped office, glancing between the paper and a form on their desk, never questioning the color of the ink. Maybe the forger stood right there, feigning boredom, maybe even tapping the pen against their palm. The psychological term for this is misdirection through banality. If something feels too ordinary, people rarely suspect it's hiding something extraordinary. Still, this first job wasn't perfect. You notice faint pencil marks beneath the blue ink, guides for where the letters should go. They weren't fully erased, and under the right angle of light, they shimmer faintly. That mistake could have exposed everything if anyone had bothered to look that closely. But they didn't. The idea nags at you. How many crimes succeed not because the criminal is brilliant, but because the people in charge of catching them are distracted? Your mind drifts to another open-ended question investigators still argue about. Did the blue ink start as a conscious strategy, or did it begin simply because the forger owned a blue pen that day? One version paints them as calculating from the start, the other as someone who stumbled into their trademark by accident. In either case, once it worked, they kept it. People cling to their lucky charms, even if they'd never admit it. The room is quiet, except for a faint ticking, an old wall clock you hadn't noticed. It's 5 minutes slow. You can't help but wonder if that was deliberate, too. A small dissonance that shifts timing just enough to create an alibi or miss a witness. Criminal thinking often seeps into the smallest details. There's a stack of scrap paper on the floor. You pick one up and find rows of the same word written over and over, guarantee. Some in neat print, some in sloppy cursive, some with decorative flourishes. You realize this was handwriting practice, over and over until the motion became automatic. You think about how practice changes the brain, how motor memory can make even a lie feel physically natural. There's a strange intimacy in knowing the forger's hand probably wrote the same word hundreds of times before it ever appeared on a real document. The repetition was both preparation and self-soothing. The bulb overhead flickers once, then steadies. Your eyes adjust, and you notice a small metal box under the desk. It's dented, the latch loose. Inside are more pens, 5 of them, all fountain, all with different nib widths. And at the very bottom, a pen with dried ink crusted at the tip, clearly older than the rest. You lift it carefully, as if it might crumble. This could have been the first pen, the one that turned blue ink from a casual choice into a calling card. You can almost imagine the thrill the first time it worked. The moment the forger realized the world would accept their false document without question. That moment must have been addictive. You set the pen down and glance back at the bank form. The edges are curling slightly, and you imagine it being passed from hand to hand decades ago, folded into a suit pocket, filed in a cabinet where it would live for years, unquestioned. That's the dangerous beauty of paperwork. Once it's in the system, it's as if it's always been there. You stand, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and step back into the hallway. The air feels heavier now, like you've been carrying the weight of someone else's secret. The first forgery wasn't flawless, but it worked. And in working, it became the seed of everything that followed. As you move toward the main study again, the scent of that royal blue ink seems stronger, as if it's bleeding through the walls. You realize it's not just a color anymore. It's a signal. A signature hidden inside a signature. You pause at the threshold of the main study, but this time your eyes are drawn not to the papers, nor the desk, but to a small wooden case on the bookshelf. It's wedged between 2 oversized law books, the kind with gold-embossed titles no one ever reads outside a courtroom. The case has a brass latch, worn smooth where fingers have opened it countless times. When you lift it down, the weight surprises you. It's heavier than it looks. The latch clicks open with a sound that feels almost too loud in the quiet room. Inside, cushioned in faded velvet, is a small magnifying loupe, a blotter, and a strange collection of tiny vials filled with liquid in varying shades of blue. You pick one up and tilt it under the lamplight. The liquid swirls thickly, catching the gold glow in a way that makes the blue deepen into something almost oceanic. The label, handwritten in tiny, perfect letters, reads, "Cobalt Feather Mix." This is where curiosity turns into obsession. You've seen criminals with habits before, rituals they use to feel in control. But here, it's different. This isn't just a matter of owning blue ink. This is a whole spectrum of blue, cataloged, tested, and preserved. You imagine the forger at this very desk, dipping nibs into different vials, testing how each flowed, how each dried, how each looked on different paper textures. A core psychological concept hovers in your mind: stimulus control. The idea that certain environments or tools can condition the brain into a specific mental state. For some, it's a lucky pair of shoes before a big game. For others, it's a particular pen and ink before committing a crime. The blue ink may not just have been a choice. It may have been the mental switch that turned an ordinary man into a forger. You sit at the desk and pull one of the vials closer. The cork stopper is brittle, and when you remove it, the smell is sharp and metallic, almost medicinal. That scent alone could have been part of the ritual, like the faint whiff of turpentine for a painter, telling the mind it's time to create. The magnifying loupe rests comfortably in your palm, and when you press it to your eye, the world shrinks down to fibers and pigment. You place it over one of the forged signatures, and suddenly the blue isn't uniform at all. Tiny granules of darker pigment are scattered throughout, creating a texture that almost sparkles under close inspection. You remember that this texture, known as sheen, is difficult to reproduce in photocopies, especially in the era before high-resolution scanners. It wasn't just beautiful, it was practical. A quirky fact surfaces from somewhere. Forensic document examiners often identify forgeries not by the handwriting itself, but by the chemical fingerprint of the ink. Different batches of ink, even from the same brand, can contain unique trace compounds. But if a forger sticks with one type, one bottle, over years, they're ironically making themselves easier to track. So why keep doing it? Maybe that's where ego comes in. You can almost hear the inner monologue. They'll never catch me. I'm too careful. It's that blend of arrogance and comfort that makes long-term criminals so fascinating and so predictable. You think about how blue ink interacts with human perception. Psychologically, blue has a calming effect. Studies show it can even slow a person's heart rate slightly. A document in blue might make someone feel more at ease, less suspicious, more willing to sign or accept it without second thought. That's the reframe. What most people see as a friendly color becomes a predator's camouflage. You reach for another vial, this one labeled Azure number 4. Inside, the ink is brighter, more playful, almost childlike. It's hard to imagine the forger using it for something as serious as a property deed or a will. Maybe it was reserved for personal notes, or maybe it was a failed experiment. A reminder that not every shade of blue worked for the con. And here's the open-ended question that tugs at you. Did the forger ever choose blue because they liked it, or was it always about the effect on others? Psychologists debate whether aesthetic preferences in criminals are genuine or purely functional. Was the ink his favorite because it was beautiful to him, or because it fooled people best? The blotter in the case is speckled with overlapping stains. Some spots are so faint they're barely visible. Others are deep enough to have soaked through the paper backing. You run your fingertip over one of the darker spots and feel a slight roughness where the pigment clotted. It's strange, realizing that these stains are the echoes of crimes long past, literal blotches of history that were never meant to be seen. You place the blotter back in its slot and notice something tucked beneath the velvet lining, a folded slip of paper. You ease it out carefully. It's a list, written in tiny script, of dates and color codes. No names, no document titles, just 2 columns. June 14, CF Mix. Sept 3, RB 12. It reads almost like a journal, but one only the writer could decode. If each entry matches a forged document, then this list is a quiet ledger of crimes. The careful tracking suggests another psychological element: control through order. The forger wasn't reckless. He cataloged his work like a collector cataloging stamps. Each job was part of a curated set. You slide the case back into place on the bookshelf, though now it feels heavier with meaning. As you step back, your eyes catch on a detail you missed before. On the far wall, there's a framed sheet of paper, slightly faded. You walk over. It's a certificate, official-looking, ornate borders, embossed seal. And in the signature space, a looping name in deep, familiar blue. The glass has a hairline crack across the corner, but the frame is otherwise pristine. You can't tell if this was the forger's proudest work or just another fake that happened to be saved. Either way, it hangs like a trophy. You think about how trophies work in the mind. For most people, they're reminders of legitimate achievements. For criminals, they're proof of mastery, evidence they outsmarted the system. But unlike most trophies, these can't be displayed publicly. That means the satisfaction comes from private ownership, the quiet thrill of looking at something and knowing no one else suspects a thing. The lamplight flickers, and for a moment the blue signature seems to shift, almost breathe. You blink, but it's still there, unmoving, fixed in time. You realize how much of this story is about perception. The ink itself hasn't changed in decades, but your understanding of it deepens with every room you explore, every object you touch. As you step back toward the desk, you feel the thread of the mystery tightening. The blue ink isn't just a preference or a habit, it's a language, one you're only just starting to learn. And the more you see of it, the more you suspect that the answers aren't in the big, flashy crimes, but in these small, precise choices that seemed insignificant to everyone except the man who made them. You leave the magnifying loupe and vials where they are, the wooden case still warm from your hands, and drift toward the far corner of the study where an old roll-top desk sits half-closed. Its curved slats are dusty, the wood worn to a soft matte finish from years of being pulled open and shut. You grip the handle and slide it up. The slats rattle faintly, as if reluctant to reveal what's inside. What emerges isn't neat stacks of paperwork this time, but a clutter of envelopes, pale, aged, and tied in bundles with thin twine. Each bundle is labeled with a year in that same looping, deliberate handwriting you've now come to recognize. And every letter inside, at first glance, is written in the same unmistakable blue ink. You untie one bundle marked 1979 and carefully unfold the top envelope. The paper is smooth, heavier than modern stationery, and smells faintly of cedar. The letter inside is never signed. It starts with a polite greeting and trails into paragraphs about pending arrangements and revised terms. Formal, but strangely warm. Then it ends abruptly. No closing, no date, no name. You realize none of these letters were ever meant to be sent. They're practice, or perhaps rehearsals for tone, testing how to phrase things in ways that would sound official without raising suspicion. A gentle but deliberate shaping of voice. That, too, is psychology at work, framing, guiding someone's interpretation of information by how it's presented. The blue ink here is softer than in the documents you've seen before, less saturated, almost faded to a sky tone. Maybe it's age, maybe it's a different batch entirely. You hold it closer to the lamplight and notice tiny feathering at the edges of the letters where the ink spread into the fibers. A reminder that paper and ink age together, and in their aging, they tell stories no forger can completely control. There's something strangely human in these unsent letters. Some lines are crossed out. Others have hesitant starts, words rewritten to soften them, as if the writer was trying to sound just persuasive enough. You imagine the forger reading each aloud in an empty room, listening for any phrase that might sound forced. A voice rehearsing lies until they sounded like truths. On the desk's interior shelf, you find a small notebook. The cover is scuffed, its spine patched with tape. Inside, the pages are filled with snippets, phrases, single words, even little doodles. But what strikes you is that every note is paired with an ink test. A small squiggle in a different shade of blue. Some are bright and playful, others so dark they're almost black. It's like looking at a palette in a painter's sketchbook. A quirky fact flickers in your mind. In the late 20th century, pen manufacturers often marketed different blue shades for specific moods. Navy for professionalism, turquoise for creativity, royal blue for formality. If the forger knew this, it could explain why different jobs might have called for subtly different blues. In the right light, most people wouldn't notice. But subconsciously, maybe they would feel it. You set the notebook down and pick up another letter. This one is more personal in tone, almost affectionate. It references a dinner that never happened, a gift that was so thoughtful, though no details are given. You can't tell if this was practice for forging personal correspondence or if it's a remnant of something real, someone the forger wrote to but never sent the words to. That's the open-ended debate that lingers. How much of a criminal's work is pure performance? and how much is drawn from genuine emotion repurposed for manipulation. You lean back in the creaky chair, letting the thought breathe. It's easy to imagine the forger sitting here on quiet evenings, the ticking clock in the background, trying out sentences, crossing out words, refilling the pen. There's an intimacy to it, even if the intent was dishonest. The act of handwriting, especially with a fountain pen, forces you to slow down, to feel each stroke. In a strange way, these unsent letters feel like the safest place to see the forger unmasked. Not because they reveal the truth, but because they reveal the process. You notice something else. Some letters have faint imprints on the back, mirror images of whatever was written on the page before them. The paper is thin enough that the pressure from the pen left behind a ghostly twin. You tilt the sheet toward the light and trace the backwards loops of a word, settlement. It's as if the letters are whispering their own quiet confession. In the bottom drawer of the desk, hidden beneath more bundles of letters, you find a small wooden box with a sliding lid. Inside are folded scraps of newspaper clippings, all neatly cut into rectangles. Each one mentions a different bank, a different company, a different court case. The clippings are small, never more than a few lines, and all are dated within weeks of the letters' labels. The forger was tracking something, maybe news about the targets of their forged documents. Maybe just the background events they needed to mimic convincingly. It makes you think about the role of context in deception. A convincing forgery isn't just about matching handwriting, it's about matching the world it claims to belong to. If a forged letter references a change in policy, that change better have actually happened. Blue ink alone wouldn't be enough. Everything around it had to fit seamlessly. The desk creaks when you close it, the roll top sliding down with a sigh. You carry one of the letters with you as you step back toward the center of the room, unable to resist reading it again. The phrasing is just bland enough to pass for bureaucratic, just polite enough to seem trustworthy. And in that trust lies the danger. It hits you then. This blue ink isn't just the medium, it's the mask. It carries with it the calm, respectable associations people have with bank signatures, professional correspondence, and family heirlooms. The forger didn't have to make people trust them. They only had to let the ink do the talking. You set the letter down on the main desk, beside the bottle of royal blue number 12, and your eyes linger on the chipped teacup you noticed earlier. You imagine the forger here again, sipping slowly between lines, maybe glancing out the rain-streaked window for inspiration, or for the reassuring sight of a quiet street. It's almost peaceful, until you remember the ripple effect each letter could have had. A forged apology, a forged agreement, a forged instruction to release funds. Small acts that could rewrite entire lives. Outside, the wind picks up, rattling the window pane. The letters shift slightly in their bundles, the twine creaking faintly. For a moment, you imagine them coming undone, spilling across the floor in a flood of blue that no one could stop. You take one last look before tucking them back inside the desk, where they've waited in silence for decades. The forger's hand is long gone, but the ink remains. Still blue, still calm, still convincing. And you're left wondering how many of these words ever found their way into the real world, folded into an envelope and trusted without question. You close the roll-top desk and step back into the center of the study, feeling as though you've just sealed away a part of the forger's mind. But another presence draws your attention. A faint pattern in the wooden floor near the far wall, where the light from the desk lamp falls short. You kneel, run your fingers over the planks, and notice one section doesn't quite match the others. The grain is the same, but the color is subtly lighter, as though the wood has been lifted and replaced too many times. It takes only a gentle tug on the corner to lift it. Beneath is a shallow compartment, and in it, a small leather satchel, stiff with age. The brass clasp snaps open with a metallic click, and inside you find another stack of documents, these far fewer in number but heavier in weight. The paper is thick, textured, almost luxurious to the touch. You spread them across the desk. Property deeds, contracts, transfer agreements. Each bears a bold, confident signature in that same rich blue ink. But here, there's no hesitation, no practice marks. Every line flows with certainty, like the hand of someone who has done this 1,000 times and no longer doubts their own skill. It's the calmness that catches you. These documents weren't rushed. There's no sign of panic in the handwriting, no irregular slant, no shaky pressure. The letters lean forward in a steady rhythm, as if the forger was breathing evenly, thinking not about whether they'd be caught, but about the aesthetics of the stroke. That calmness is a psychological weapon in itself. It reminds you of affect regulation, how some people use rituals to control their emotional state. The act of sitting down, uncapping the pen, filling it with the perfect shade of blue. These might have been the steps that helped the forger slip into a state of quiet focus, a mental room where fear didn't enter. One of the contracts lists a transfer of land between two shell companies. You can't tell if the companies ever existed outside this page, but the precision of the writing suggests they might not have needed to. In fraud, the trick is often to create something so unremarkable that no one bothers to question it. A small plot of land here, a minor change of ownership there, moves so subtle they disappear into the noise of everyday paperwork. You notice an oddity on one page, a small dot of darker blue just above the crossbar of a T. At first you think it's an accident, a slip of the pen, but looking closer, you see it's too perfectly placed. Could it be a hidden mark? A private code? Criminals sometimes build signatures into their work that only they can recognize, a way of claiming authorship without leaving an obvious confession. That idea opens another question. Did the forger see these acts as art? Not in the romanticized sense of a gentleman criminal, but in the literal sense, crafting something beautiful and functional with no one to appreciate it but themselves. It's not so different from an artist who hides a small detail in every painting, a detail only they know exists. You flip through the stack until you reach the oldest looking document. The paper is yellowed, the corners bent. The ink, while still blue, has softened into something almost gray. And yet, even here, the lines are precise. You find yourself holding your breath, afraid to smudge it. A quirky fact slips into your mind. Archival studies have shown that blue dyes in certain inks degrade differently than black, often holding their hue longer under low light conditions. The forger might not have known this scientifically, but maybe they noticed it over time, how their blue stayed vivid while black documents faded. If you were trying to build a record that would outlast suspicion, that detail would be gold. You place the papers back in the satchel, but one last sheet catches your attention. It's a handwritten note, almost a meditation. The handwriting is looser here, more personal. It reads, "Ink remembers what hands forget." You stare at the line, unsure whether it's meant as a confession, a warning, or a mantra. You sit in the chair and let the words roll through your head. Ink remembers. Once a document exists, it can be found decades later, long after memory fades. Maybe that's the double edge of the forger's calmness, the ability to work without fear, but also the inability to erase the trail completely. You imagine the scene of creation, the forger at the desk, the pen gliding across paper in even strokes, the ink drying in slow, perfect lines. Outside, maybe rain tapping at the window. Inside, only the scratch of the nib and the quiet satisfaction of each completed flourish. You can almost feel the weight of the pen in your own hand, the subtle resistance of the paper under your fingers. Experts still debate whether such calm comes from confidence in skill or from a personality trait, a low reactivity to stress. Some argue that certain criminals are drawn to forgery precisely because it doesn't involve the adrenaline of a heist or a chase. It's the crime of those who prefer control over chaos. And here in this study, you see the evidence of someone who thrived in that control. The wind outside presses harder against the windows now, and the lamplight trembles slightly. You glance at the bottle of Royal Blue number 12, and for a moment, the surface of the ink inside seems to ripple. You know it's just a trick of the light, but it makes you think of the satchel beneath the floor, sealed away for years, waiting quietly like a secret too patient to fade. You return the documents to their compartment, pressing the wood plank back into place until it blends with the rest of the floor. Standing, you notice your fingertips are faintly stained, the blue ghost of ink that's decades old. You rub at it, but it doesn't fully come off. That's when you realize maybe the calmness wasn't just about keeping fear away. Maybe it was about leaving something behind, something that would outlive both the crime and the criminal. The forger's work didn't shout for attention, it whispered. And in that whisper, it carried the confidence that someone, someday, would notice. You step back toward the desk, letting the lamplight settle over everything again. The satchel is hidden, the papers are still, but the room feels altered now, like you've disturbed the air enough that it will take hours to settle again. You take one last look at the chipped teacup, the pen, the bottle of ink. The scene is unchanged, but you know the calmness in this room is an illusion. It's not the peace of innocence, it's the stillness of something perfectly concealed. You don't hear him at first, the investigator, because his presence is the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself with the slam of a door or the clearing of a throat. It's just the subtle change in air when someone else shares the space. You turn, and there he is, leaning slightly against the doorframe, his trench coat damp at the edges from the drizzle outside. His eyes aren't the sharp, cinematic kind you expect from TV detectives. They're tired. Observant, yes, but in the way of someone who's spent too many years watching people lie without blinking. He steps into the room without asking. His gaze moves across the desk, the floor, the shelves, not rushing, just cataloging. When he finally speaks, his voice is calm, low, the words drawn out in a slow rhythm. You notice the ink yet? You nod. You nod, though you don't answer right away. It feels like a test. He moves toward the desk, sliding a hand across the blotter as if he's checking for heat. Then he pulls a slim notebook from his pocket, flipping it open to a page that's clearly been revisited countless times. It's filled with dates, names, and small rectangles of paper, each holding a scribbled blue signature. This is the pattern, he says, tapping one rectangle with his finger. Pressure here, a little heavier on the downstroke when he uses blue, lighter when it's black, like the color changes how his hand moves. It's a small detail, but it sticks in your mind. You've read about this, how kinesthetic feedback can shift depending on the tool or medium. In psychological terms, it's almost like muscle memory is color-coded. The investigator explains that under magnification, the ink flow in the forger's blue signatures reveals slightly more hesitation on curves, but more confidence on straight lines. A quirk unique enough to be a fingerprint. He sets the notebook down, leaning against the desk like he's been here before. Problem is, he says, people don't see hesitation, they see color, and blue says trustworthy. A quirky fact slips into the conversation. He tells you that in the early days of forensic handwriting analysis, investigators sometimes underestimated color entirely, treating it as cosmetic. We learned too late that the choice of ink could be as intentional as the choice of words, he says. And this guy, he knew it before we did. He picks up the chipped teacup, turning it slowly in his hand. I've sat in this room more times than I can count, he says. Every time, it feels like the walls are watching me. Like the moment I turn my back, the room goes back to keeping his secrets. You can feel the pull of the mystery between the two of you now, not in the dramatic movie scene way, but in the slow tightening of a shared puzzle. You're both studying a ghost whose presence lingers in handwriting and color choices. The investigator opens a drawer and pulls out a sheet protector, sliding a forged deed inside into the light. Look here, he says, pointing to the signature. See the way the blue's thicker on the left side of the downstroke? That's capillary action. Fountain pen nibs split just slightly when pressure's applied, and with this particular ink, the left tine dumps more pigment. I've only seen it happen with this mix. It's another layer you hadn't considered, the mechanics of the pen itself becoming part of the criminal profile. The weird part, he adds, he probably didn't even need to keep using the same pen, but he did. People stick to their rituals. You ask him if that's why the case has never been fully closed, because the details are too small for a jury to care about. He smirks, though it's not a happy smirk. A jury wants a smoking gun, he says. All I've got is a bottle of blue ink and a feeling. He tells you about the first time he came across the forger's work, an inheritance dispute that unraveled into a chain of suspicious documents. At first, he thought the ink was incidental, but then it kept showing up. Different towns, different victims, but always the same hue. And you know what the kicker is? He says, leaning closer. We don't even know if he started with blue on purpose. Maybe it was just the pen he had that day. But once it worked, once it slid past someone without a second glance, he was hooked. Happens all the time. Success turns accidents into strategy. You let that sit for a moment, feeling the weight of it. It's an open-ended truth, one investigators and psychologists both wrestle with. Was the blue ink a calculated choice from the start, or a superstition born from a lucky break? The investigator admits he doesn't know, and that bothers him more than he wants to admit. Outside, rain streaks the window. He moves to stand beside it, looking out like he's measuring the street. "Every time I think I'm close," he says softly, something slips away. The trail's not cold, exactly. It's just faint, like trying to follow a scent through rain. You notice his hands, how still they are. Not restless, not fidgeting. It's the stillness of someone who's learned patience the hard way. You think about how similar that stillness is to the forger's calm. Two sides of the same coin, one using calm to evade, the other using it to pursue. The investigator reaches into his coat and pulls out a small plastic case. Inside is a pen, sleek, silver, Leon, its nib darkened with old stains. "Found this in a pawn shop," he says. "Could be his, could be someone else's. Either way, it writes the same way. Same weight, same drag on the paper." He offers it to you, and you take it, feeling the balance shift between your fingers. You imagine the forger's hand on it, the smooth slide of nib over paper, the tiny variations in pressure that would leave microscopic differences invisible to anyone but an expert. The sensation is oddly intimate, like borrowing someone's glasses and seeing the world through their prescription. When you hand it back, he doesn't put it away. Instead, he sets it gently on the desk beside the bottle of Royal Blue No. 12. The two objects sit there like old co-conspirators, their history too tangled to separate. "You've seen the papers," he says finally. "You've seen the room. The trick isn't finding the work, it's proving it's all his." He sighs, and for a moment, you catch something behind his eyes, a mixture of admiration and frustration. If he weren't on the wrong side of the law, I'd almost call it craftsmanship. You both stand in the quiet for a while, the rain's rhythm soft against the window. Then he moves toward the door, pausing with one hand on the frame. "If you notice anything I missed," he says, "write it down. Details matter, especially the ones that seem too small to matter." When he leaves, the room feels a shade dimmer. You find yourself staring at the pen he left on the desk, wondering if you'll ever know for sure whether it wrote any of the blue lines you've been chasing. And even if you did, would it change anything? The pen is still there the next morning, right where the investigator left it, its silver body catching the pale wash of early light through the curtains. You don't touch it at first. You just stand in the doorway, staring, as if it might decide to write something on its own while you're watching. The blue ink bottle sits beside it like a loyal accomplice, glass thick with dust except for the rim where fingers have gripped it more recently. You move into the study, your footsteps sinking into the rug with a muffled hush. The air feels heavier today, the kind of stillness that makes you overly aware of your own breathing. You pick up the pen at last, feeling its weight shift toward the nib, balanced for a hand that knew precision. If the investigator was right, this wasn't just about color, it was about camouflage. That's when you see it, a stack of old legal ledgers half hidden on the bottom shelf. You pull one free, the spine creaking in protest, and flip it open. Rows upon rows of entries in faded ink fill the pages, most in the formal black of clerical records. But here and there, in what could almost pass for an unremarkable variation, a note appears in blue. Not bright, not garish, muted enough to blend in unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. You trace a finger over one of the signatures. The texture of the page changes slightly under the blue, almost as if the fibers took to it differently. It's not just your imagination. Paper, especially archival paper, responds differently to certain pigments. Black sits on top, sharp and assertive. Blue seeps in just enough to soften the edges. That softness, you realize, could be the point. It makes the writing look older, like it's been there for decades. The quirk is subtle but significant. Blue ink can often bypass suspicion in document authentication because older archives naturally contain a mix of inks from different eras. Black stands out as too modern or too bold in certain contexts, but blue, especially a slightly faded one, can slip through unnoticed. The forger's brilliance wasn't in hiding, it was in blending. You recall the investigator's notebook, the careful documentation of pressure shifts. Now you can imagine him here, crouched over these very pages, squinting through magnifiers, tracing the faintest curve of a forged stroke. A memory surfaces, an article you once read about an art restorer who could mimic 18th century ink compositions so perfectly that chemical tests couldn't tell the difference. She said her secret wasn't the formula itself, but knowing how to let the ink breathe into the paper. The thought makes you wonder, was the forger an artist first, or a criminal who discovered artistry by necessity? You lean back against the desk, letting your eyes wander across the room. The walls are lined with frames, maps, certificates, and what looks like an original shipping manifest from the early 1900s. The paper has browned evenly, but the ink, you can almost see the logic now. The blue entries fade in a way that feels natural, almost friendly. Black can look like it's shouting after 100 years. Blue just whispers. There's a debate that bubbles quietly in your head, the kind of thing forensic document examiners might argue over coffee. Was this choice of blue a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, or simply a habit that happened to work? Experts still argue whether his consistency was intentional craft or ritualistic superstition. If it was craft, it means every stroke was planned like a chess move. If it was superstition, then his entire career rode on the fragile belief that one color was luckier than another. You hear faint street noise outside, a cart rolling over cobblestones, a bicycle bell, the hollow call of a vendor. The sounds make you think of the kind of neighborhoods where his documents might have slipped into circulation, unremarked and unquestioned. On the desk, you notice something else, a slip of paper you'd overlooked before. It's not filed away or hidden, just sitting there under the lip of the blotter like a bookmark in a too-thick novel. You slide it free and see a partial address written in, of course, blue ink. The street name is clear, but the number is smudged. You try to imagine the moment it was written. Was he jotting it down from memory, already thinking about the forgery it might become? Or was it just an idle note that meant nothing at all? A curious fact pops into your head. In some European courts during the mid-20th century, blue ink became unofficially preferred for signing legal documents because it was easier for clerks to distinguish originals from carbon copies, which usually printed in black. That little bureaucratic quirk could have been the open door the forger needed. If officials were primed to see blue as legitimate, his work would walk right past suspicion. You set the slip of paper down, but its smudged number keeps tugging at your mind. You picture the investigator finding it, tucking it away in his trench coat, and walking off into the drizzle without a word. Your eyes drift to the window. The light is shifting now, clouds drifting lazily past. You can almost imagine the forger himself sitting where you are, pen in hand, looking out at a similar day, timing his next move not by urgency, but by opportunity. That's the unnerving part, his patience. Forgery isn't a crime of passion. It's a crime of waiting until no one is looking. You pull another ledger from the shelf. This one's newer, the paper slightly whiter, but still speckled with the occasional blue. You catch yourself holding your breath as you flip through it, searching for the small inconsistencies that might give him away. And there it is, a flourish on the Y in a surname that feels too deliberate, too practiced to be the original writers. You think about muscle memory again, how people develop unconscious patterns in their writing, tiny signatures of movement that can't be faked for long. The forger must have studied each target's hand for hours, absorbing its rhythm until it felt natural enough to copy. And yet, the blue remains constant, like a fingerprint hiding in plain sight. The debate comes back into your mind. Genius or superstition? You're starting to think it could be both. Maybe the genius was in letting the superstition carry him, giving the act a sense of ritual, a mental anchor that kept his hand steady. Outside, the clouds break just enough for a weak stripe of sunlight to fall across the desk. It hits the blue ink bottle, scattering faint cobalt reflections on the blotter. For a moment, you're caught staring at the play of color like it might give you the answer the investigator never found. But it doesn't. It just sits there, unbothered, as if it knows it's been winning this game for decades. You place the pen back where it was, aligned perfectly with the bottle, and close the ledger. The dust motes drift lazily in the light, as if even they aren't in any rush to leave this room. And neither are you. Not yet. The kitchen smells faintly of stale tea and something metallic, Old pipes, maybe. You sit at a small round table that wobbles slightly under your elbow. The linoleum under your feet is worn to a soft sheen, the pattern barely visible anymore. Someone has tried to brighten the space with a vase of plastic flowers in the center, but the dust on their petals betrays how long they've been here. Across from you, two people nurse lukewarm cups of tea, their hands wrapped around the mugs like they're holding on to the only warmth in the room. They're old acquaintances of the forger. At least, that's how they introduce themselves. You can't tell yet whether they're here out of loyalty or curiosity. The first, a man with a voice that crackles like old radio static, claims he once saw the forger write 3 perfect signatures in a row without pausing. He says it like he's describing a magician pulling coins from thin air. The second, a woman with a gaze that feels almost too direct, insists the forger's choice of blue ink was just because it didn't bleed on cheap paper. She says it with the finality of someone who has told this story too many times already. You sip your tea, too weak, too tepid, but the warmth is pleasant. The steam curls lazily upward, disappearing before it reaches your face. The man leans forward, elbows on the table. He wasn't doing it for money, you know. Not really. He liked the neatness of it, the control. His words hang in the air for a moment, and you feel them settle like dust. It's an odd theory, but one that fits more than you want to admit. The woman shakes her head. Control, maybe. But you don't risk prison time for neatness. There was something personal, something he wasn't telling anyone. They go back and forth, voices low but insistent, like they're rehearsing an argument they've had before. You watch the steam from their mugs coil and twist, merging into the same invisible air despite their disagreement. You glance at the counter behind them. There's an old ceramic teapot with a hairline crack running along the spout. The crack has been mended, not perfectly, but carefully, with a thin golden resin. Kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing with gold, turns flaws into part of the object's story. The forger, you think, might have liked that idea. Imperfection disguised as artistry. The conversation drifts to the day the investigator first came around. The man says he remembers the way the forger stayed calm, even as others in the neighborhood whispered. He didn't hide, the man says. Didn't bolt. He just sat in his chair, drinking tea, same as always. You imagine that scene vividly. The slow stirring of sugar, the sound of porcelain against porcelain, the blue ink pen lying within arm's reach. The woman interrupts with a detail that makes you stop mid-sip. He kept one pen separate from the others, wrapped in a cloth. Never used it unless he meant business. Your mind flashes back to the pen in the study, resting beside the ink bottle. Was that the one? You picture it now, the gleam of the nib under the light, the way it felt balanced in your hand. The thought that it might have been his serious pen sends a strange shiver down your spine. The tea has cooled completely in your cup, but you keep holding it, letting the mug warm your palms. The rhythm of their conversation slows, the way talk does when people start circling old ground. You ask what the forger was like outside of his work. The man says he was quiet, but funny in small doses. The kind of humor you had to earn, he adds. The woman nods, but adds that he had a habit of watching people write. Not reading their words, just watching how their hands moved across the page. A curious fact springs to mind. Graphologists, people who study handwriting, sometimes claim they can detect personality traits from the angle, pressure, and speed of writing. It's controversial, more art than science, but you wonder if the forger believed in it. Maybe blue ink wasn't just about blending in. It could have been about reading the rhythm of the hand, the way music lovers read sheet music. The man sets his mug down with a soft clink. You know, he says, people think he picked blue because it was clever. But I think it was a habit he turned into a strategy, like wearing the same lucky tie to every meeting. Eventually, you forget if you started for the luck or the logic. The woman tilts her head in agreement, though she doesn't look convinced. Or maybe, she says, he just liked it, and everyone else is making a mystery where there isn't one. The idea lingers, unsettling in its simplicity. You've been searching for layers, for hidden meanings, but what if the answer was always just preference? People form attachments to colors for reasons even they can't articulate. Maybe blue simply felt right in his hand. A draft stirs through the kitchen, rattling a spoon in its saucer. You glance toward the doorway and catch a glimpse of the street outside. Wet cobblestones shining under a sky that can't decide between rain and sun. When you look back, the man is telling a story about the last time he saw the forger. He was sitting by the window, writing something. I asked him what it was, and he said, "Just a little something for later." Never saw him again after that. You feel the silence that follows. It's not heavy, more like the space left behind by a song that's faded out. The woman stands to refill the teapot, and you notice the way she moves, unhurried, deliberate, as if the act of making tea is its own form of punctuation. You think about the forger's movements, the way he must have slowed himself to match the pace of his work. Somewhere in the back of your mind, an open loop tightens. If his choice of ink was about blending in, then tea might have been about something similar. Something that doesn't draw attention, something that makes you part of the background until you choose otherwise. The man looks at you, his eyes narrowing slightly. "If you're going to write about him," he says, "don't make him out to be some kind of monster. He wasn't cruel, just particular." The kettle begins to whistle softly. The woman turns off the flame, pours the water, and the scent of fresh tea rises into the room. You realize you've been sitting here for over an hour, caught in their quiet orbit. When you finally stand to leave, the man says something that lodges in your mind. Blue or black, it wouldn't have mattered if you didn't know where to look. As you step back into the street, the air feels cooler, cleaner. The conversation replays in your head. The theories, the contradictions, the golden crack in the teapot. You can't decide which version of the forger is truer. The strategist, the sentimentalist, or just a man who liked the way blue looked on paper. Maybe, you think, all three can exist at once. You wander away from the kitchen and down a narrow lane, the sound of your footsteps soft against the damp pavement. The conversations you've just left keep looping in your head. The man's certainty, the woman's skepticism, the way both clung to their own versions of the truth. It makes you wonder how much of anyone's truth is really just a reflection of what they want to see. You pass a bookshop with fogged-up windows, and in the glass you catch your own reflection. Hair a little wind-tossed, coat buttoned unevenly. You're not just here to hear about blue ink anymore. You're here because this strange, specific preference has turned into a mirror for your own habits, the little rituals you've never questioned. Inside the shop, it smells faintly of paper and something sharper, maybe glue. The owner, a quiet man with round glasses and a cardigan that's seen better decades, is stacking a row of psychology books. You ask if he knows anything about color psychology. He smiles faintly, the kind of smile that suggests both patience and a hint of amusement, and gestures toward a corner shelf. You trail your fingers along the spines, the psychology of color, perception and emotion, the secret life of the palette. The covers are full of bold reds, serene blues, earthy greens. A particular chapter heading catches your eye. Blue, the trustworthy color. You flip it open and scan a few lines. The author claims blue triggers feelings of stability and reliability, which is why so many banks and government agencies use it in their branding. In handwriting, blue can seem less severe than black, but more deliberate than lighter colors. You think of the forger's calm, the precision in his work, and wonder if he'd known this intuitively, or if he'd stumbled into the same territory by accident. The shopkeeper returns, setting down a mug of tea beside you, as if everyone in this town has silently agreed that tea is the currency of conversation. He says, "There's a theory, completely unproven, that people who prefer blue in writing are better at compartmentalizing. They keep things tidy in their minds. Dangerous skill in the wrong context." You nod, feeling the weight of that phrase. Dangerous skill. You can see how it would serve a forger, letting them slip into the mindset needed to mimic a stranger's handwriting without getting tangled in moral hesitation. A quirky fact drifts up from memory. In certain ink manufacturing circles, the shade called royal blue was once nicknamed the diplomat's choice because it was formal without being cold. It makes you wonder whether the forger ever thought about the shade of blue, or if any would do, as long as it was that family of color. The shopkeeper tilts his head. "Of course," he says, "some argue the whole psychology of color thing is overrated. Mood and meaning change with culture. In some places, blue's linked with mourning. So what does that say about all these neat little theories? It's an open question you can't easily answer. Maybe the blue ink didn't symbolize anything stable or calming for the forger. Maybe it was his own private emblem of loss. The possibility lingers, unsettling but compelling. You buy the book, more for the margin notes you plan to make than for the text itself, and step back into the chill. Your hands are warm from the tea, and the street seems quieter now, though the clouds above have thickened to a muted silver. A few blocks later, you find yourself in front of the small municipal archive, its brick walls streaked with rain-darkened lines. Inside, the fluorescent lighting hums faintly, and the air smells faintly of dust and cardboard. Rows of labeled boxes stretch out in long aisles. You pull one from the shelf, property deeds from the 1980s, and lay it open on a long wooden table. Page after page of cramped official handwriting stares back at you, the ink mostly faded to gray. But here and there, a signature in deep blue leaps out. The shade is unmistakable, even after decades. Your mind catches on a detail from the bookshop conversation, compartmentalizing. The signatures here are all business. No flourishes, no stray marks. It's as if the writer had stepped into the role completely, leaving no trace of himself beyond the ink. Another file contains letters between lawyers, the blue ink standing in for formal agreement where black typewritten words felt too impersonal. The contrast is striking. The printed lines feel like rules, but the blue script feels like decisions. You lean back, eyes tracing the long hallway of shelves. It's not hard to imagine the forger moving through here years ago, scanning documents for styles to mimic. You picture him pausing now and then, running his fingers over the paper, not out of sentiment, but to understand its weight and texture. A quiet tap at your shoulder pulls you from the thought. An archivist, thin and brisk, asks if you're researching the old case. Her tone is neutral, but her eyes sharpen with interest when you confirm. "I always thought the blue ink was arrogance," she says, leaving a mark that stood out just enough to be noticed if you were paying attention, like a dare. It's a different angle entirely, one that reframes everything. What if the choice wasn't about blending in or personal comfort, but about sending a coded message to anyone clever enough to spot it? You thank her, but her comment stays with you as you leave the archive. Back on the street, you pause at a bench under a lamppost. The sky has deepened to a twilight blue, not far from the shade in those signatures. You take the book from your bag, flip to a blank page, and pull out your own pen. The ink flows in black, but for a moment you imagine it in blue, how it might feel different under your hand, how it might subtly change the way you form each letter. The thought is oddly intimate, almost dangerous. You write just one word, "Why?" Then you close the book and slip it away. Because the real answer might not be in psychology texts or property archives. It might be tangled somewhere between preference, habit, and an impulse no one, including the forger, ever fully understood. The evening air feels heavier now, a kind of damp weight that settles on your shoulders as you walk. Street lamps flicker to life one by one, casting small pools of gold across the uneven pavement. Somewhere nearby, a radio plays a tinny old song, the notes drifting through an open window before dissolving into the night. You're heading toward a place someone in the bookshop mentioned, a quiet pub near the edge of town where the forger was said to spend long hours, usually in the same corner seat. Not drinking heavily, just occupying space, like someone trying to blend into the furniture. When you push open the door, you're met with the low murmur of conversation and the scent of something fried lingering in the air. The floorboards creak underfoot as you make your way past a few regulars who glance up, then back down at their pints. The bartender, a woman in her 40s with a sharp bob and a sharper gaze, nods toward the back. "That was his spot," she says before you can even ask. The corner table is half-shadowed, tucked between a brick wall and a window, so smudged it turns the outside world into a watercolor blur. There's still a faint scratch in the tabletop, 3 short, parallel lines, almost too deliberate to be accidental. You run your fingertips over them, the grooves shallow but distinct. The bartender brings you a drink without asking what you want. "He ordered tea here too," she says with a small smirk. "In a pub. People thought it was odd, but he said the beer made his hands clumsy." You picture that, a man so focused on precision that he'd avoid anything that might loosen the exactness of his script. It fits with a psychological concept you've been turning over since the archive visit: self-regulation. The ability to manage impulses, maintain control over one's own actions, even in environments designed to erode it. It's a skill that can be a virtue or a weapon. A small, framed photo hangs just above the table, sepia-toned, edges curling. 4 men sit at the very spot where you're now sitting. One of them, you suspect, is the forger, though his hair is darker, his smile faint but real. In his right hand, almost out of frame, there's the glint of a pen. The bartender leans against the bar and calls over. He'd write on napkins sometimes. Little bits of poetry, quotes, fake autographs. We'd sweep them up when closing, but he never seemed to care if they were thrown out. It's an odd contradiction. You'd expect a man so careful to hoard every scrap of his work. Maybe those napkins weren't real work at all, just idle exercises. Or maybe discarding them was part of the ritual, a way of keeping his true projects invisible. You recall a quirky fact from a psychology seminar. Some people perform better when they create decoy tasks alongside the real one. The fakes distract outsiders, while the real work stays hidden. Was the blue ink part of that misdirection? Or were the napkins the real misdirection, and the ink was the tell? A man at the bar, older with a wool cap pulled low, catches your eye. He raises his glass slightly, a wordless signal, then comes to join you. He doesn't introduce himself, just sits and says, "You're chasing the blue, aren't you?" You nod. He stares into the middle distance for a long moment before speaking again. "You want to know the truth?" He once told me black ink was for things you didn't want questioned. Blue was for things you wanted remembered. The statement is so clean, so final, that you feel a small, involuntary shiver. It's the kind of explanation that feels true, even if it's only one man's interpretation. "Of course," he adds with a crooked grin, "maybe he just said that to make me feel clever." You laugh softly, and for a moment, the tension in your shoulders eases. But the words lodge in your mind. Blue for memory. It reframes the ink choice entirely, not as camouflage, but as a breadcrumb trail for those paying attention. You thank him, finish your drink, and step outside. The street is quiet, the pub's yellow lights spilling onto the cobblestones. You start walking without a clear destination, letting your feet choose. A drizzle begins, so fine it barely darkens the pavement. It makes the air smell cleaner, like wet stone and faint tobacco. You pass a postbox. It's paint chipped but still the same bright red, and wonder if the forger ever paused at one like this, sliding in an envelope with carefully penned lies disguised as truths. There's another open loop in your mind now, one you can't quite close. If blue was for things to be remembered, then what exactly was he trying to preserve? A signature? A name? A feeling? The answer could be anywhere. In a napkin thrown away decades ago, in an archive drawer, in someone's fading memory. You reach the river without realizing you've been heading for it. The water moves slow tonight, reflecting the glow of the lamps in long, broken ribbons. You lean on the railing, watching tiny ripples distort the lights. Somewhere behind you, a clock chimes the hour, and the sound blends with the rhythm of the water. You think about how habits, like choosing a particular ink, can become invisible to the person who practices them. What starts as a choice becomes a default, and the original reason fades. You pull the book from your bag again, this time flipping to the chapter on ritualized behavior. It talks about how repeated actions can create a sense of security, even if the action has no direct effect on the outcome. Athletes wearing the same socks for every game, writers using the same mug each morning. For a forger, maybe blue ink wasn't just a preference, it was a grounding point, the color that steadied his hand before the fraud began. And yet, there's that bartender's scratch in the tabletop, the archivist's theory of arrogance, the old man's blue for memory. Each explanation could be true on its own, or none could be. You close the book and rest your elbows on the railing, letting the rain bead on your coat. The sound of the water is hypnotic, pulling your thoughts into slower currents. You can almost hear his pen scratching on paper, the deliberate strokes, the pauses, the tiny flourish at the end of a letter. Not the real sound, of course, just your mind filling in the gaps. When you finally turn away from the river, the streets feel emptier, but the questions remain, their edges softened by the rain. Somewhere, you think, the answer is written down, in blue, and waiting. You wake the next morning in the small guest house room you'd rented, the faint sound of rain still tapping against the window. For a moment, you stay in bed, watching the way the droplets slide down the glass, merging and splitting like slow-moving thoughts. The night before had left you with too many threads to hold at once. The bartender's easy smirk, the old man's cryptic "blue for memory," the idea of ritualized behavior from the psychology book. They swirl together now, an untidy palette of theories, each one pulling you in a different direction. Downstairs, the guest house kitchen smells of toast and something citrusy. The owner, a thin woman with a cardigan pulled tight around her, pours you coffee before you even ask. She seems to know everyone's business here. When you mention you're looking into old local cases, she just hums and sets a folded piece of paper on the table. It's a copy of a police inventory list from decades ago, with certain items highlighted in yellow. Several letters, a ledger book, and a half-empty bottle of blue ink. You trace your finger along the printed words, wondering how an object as mundane as an ink bottle can end up logged alongside pieces of evidence in a criminal file. The owner notices your interest. The ink was an import, she says, sitting opposite you. French. He didn't buy it here. Someone brought it to him. Could have just as easily used something from the shop on the high street, but he didn't. A small but telling detail. It touches on a psychological concept that had come up in your reading, signaling behavior. People often make choices that send subtle messages to themselves or to others, whether consciously or not. Choosing imported ink when domestic would do might have been a way of reinforcing an image, sophisticated, worldly, perhaps just slightly untouchable. You imagine him unscrewing the cap, the faint chemical tang of the liquid filling the air, a small ritual in itself. Maybe it was about control, not just in his work, but in every surrounding detail. You thank her and pocket the paper. The rain has lightened outside, more mist than drizzle now, and you make your way toward the train station. Not to leave town, but because the old station master's office is still there, tucked into one end of the platform. Someone told you it's been converted into a sort of community notice board / storage space, but the drawers and files haven't all been cleared. Inside, the air is tinged with dust and engine oil. A wall of pigeonhole shelves still holds scraps of forgotten correspondence, lost and found claims, train schedules from years gone by, handwritten notes in every imaginable style. It's a goldmine for someone who wants to see the evolution of local handwriting, the way the curves of letters shift over time. And there it is, an envelope addressed in an elegant Kua looping script, the ink still vividly blue despite the paper's yellowing edges. You don't even have to read the name to recognize the style. Tight but fluid, confident without ostentation. The kind of hand you've been chasing through this town. You hold it gently, half afraid it might disintegrate. The letter inside is short, only a few lines, about meeting for coffee and discussion at a location that no longer exists. There's no date, no signature, just that unmistakable ink, and at the bottom, a tiny smudge where the pen must have paused a fraction too long. That smudge catches you. It feels human, unguarded, as though for a split second, the forger was thinking of something else entirely. You can almost hear the internal debate. Finish the letter, or just stop here? You're tempted to pocket the envelope, but instead you take a photograph and slide it back into its slot. The temptation reminds you of a quirky fact you'd read last night. Some collectors of rare letters prize ink smudges above perfect pages, claiming the flaws make the artifact feel more alive. You step back out onto the platform, where a light fog is curling between the buildings. The day has that muted, closed-in quality that makes the world feel smaller. On the walk back, you mull over a nagging question. If blue ink was meant to be memorable, as the old man at the pub claimed, why leave it in a place so public, so vulnerable to being overlooked or discarded? Unless, of course, that was the point. Scatter the trail so widely that no one piece seems important until you've gathered them all. The theory sits in your mind like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit yet. By mid-afternoon, you're in a cafe near the center of town, the kind of place where mismatched mugs are part of the charm. You spread your notes across the table, photographs of signatures, copies of old documents, fragments of overheard stories. You start looking for patterns, not just in what's present, but in what's absent. A woman at the next table leans over slightly, peering at your notes. "I remember him," she says, almost casually. "Always carried two pens, one blue, one black. Never used the black in public." You ask why, but she just shrugs. Maybe it was about keeping things separate, work and whatever else. The idea of duality appeals to you. Psychologists sometimes talk about cognitive partitioning, the mental act of keeping separate identities or activities entirely distinct from each other, even in the same person's mind. If the black ink was for the hidden, the legal, the quiet, then the blue was for the part of him that wanted to be seen, even if it meant risk. It's an unsettling thought that someone could build their entire life around maintaining such a split and succeed for as long as he did. You sip your coffee slowly, letting the flavor ground you in the present. Outside, the rain has stopped completely, leaving the streets slick and shining. In the cafe window's reflection, you catch yourself holding your pen in an oddly deliberate way, as though mimicking the photographs you've been studying. You shake it off, pack your notes, and head toward the guest house again. But your steps slow when you pass a stationery shop. The window display is crowded with notebooks, sealing wax, and rows of ink bottles. Inside, the air smells faintly of cedar and paper. You wander to the back, where the inks are lined up like tiny stained glass windows, emerald, scarlet, obsidian, and there, several shades of blue. One bottle in particular draws you, deep, almost midnight, with a slight shimmer in the glass. You pick it up, turning it in your hand. The shopkeeper, a young man with sleeves rolled to his elbows, says, "That one's French import. Smooth flow, won't feather on the page." It's almost absurd how the details match what you heard this morning. You set it down carefully, feeling a strange pulse of recognition, and step back into the street. The air is cooler now, the evening just starting to gather. And somewhere in your mind, you can hear that slow, deliberate scratch of pen on paper, the kind that leaves behind not just words, but a trail of questions no one has yet answered. The evening folds over the town like a heavy wool blanket, muting the edges of every sound. You walk with your collar turned up, the cool air holding that faint metallic tang that comes just before true night. The streets are half empty now, puddles reflecting fractured versions of the lamplight. You've been carrying the image of that French ink bottle with you all day, as if its color has stained your thoughts. When you finally reach the guest house, the dining room is deserted except for the owner's cat, who's taken up the far end of the bench. It stares at you like you're interrupting something important. Upstairs, you spread your notes again. But instead of looking for the forger's hand in documents, you decide to turn your attention inward. You try to picture the moment of choice. Dozens of ink colors on a table, the slight pause before selecting blue. Was it impulse? Calculation? Nostalgia? Memory has a way of tinting reality, after all. Blue might have looked calmer, more trustworthy, even to him. That thought sends you back to a concept you'd brushed against earlier: false memory construction. Psychologists know that people can vividly recall details that never actually happened, often influenced by subtle suggestion. What if the reason so many witnesses and victims swear the ink was a certain shade is because they expect it to be? The mind fills in gaps with what feels right. You test it on yourself. You close your eyes and think of the signature from the station master's office. In your mind's eye, the ink gleams bright cobalt. But when you look at the photograph again, it's clearly more muted, almost grayed with age. Memory is a trickster, and in the case of the forger, maybe that trickster was a silent accomplice. There's an odd comfort in this idea that the blue ink, even when real, existed partly in the imagination of its observers. It reframes the whole question of intent. Perhaps the forger's genius wasn't just in crafting documents, but in crafting memory itself. Outside your window, the rain starts again. Light, persistent, the sort that doesn't drive people indoors, but slows them down. You decide to walk. The streets are reflective mosaics now, each step scattering little bursts of distorted color. You pass the stationery shop again. It's closed, but the bottles in the window glow faintly in the warm display light, like a row of tiny captive sunsets. You keep moving toward the quieter end of town, where houses give way to overgrown lots. A local had told you this was where the forger once lived, a modest two-story place with a garden he never tended. You find it half hidden behind a leaning fence. The windows are dark, but the structure's still intact. You rest a hand on the gate, feeling the wood's soft give beneath your palm. There's a smell of damp earth and something faintly chemical, though it could just be your imagination tugging at the edges of the scene. For a long moment, you stand there, picturing him at a desk just inside, pen poised, the tip trembling with the first bead of blue. It's a strangely intimate vision, and you're reluctant to break it. You step back instead, letting the image fade, and follow the narrow lane to a pub you haven't visited before. Inside, it's warm but not crowded. The bartender looks up and says, "Back again?" even though you've never been here. You take a corner table and order tea, then pull out the folder of photographs. The bartender glances at them when delivering your drink and chuckles. "Ah, the famous blue ink. My gran used to tell me it was actually black, but the light in his study made it look blue." You pause. "What kind of light?" "Old lamps. Amber glass shades. Makes everything softer, warmer. Black could take on a bluish tint under it, especially on cream paper." The idea lands like a small shock. What if, despite everything, you've been chasing the wrong pigment entirely? Experts still argue whether the ink's color was intentional or an accident of environment. You nurse your tea, letting the steam curl upward, and consider the implications. If the blue was only ever a trick of light, then its role shifts completely. It becomes not a deliberate calling card, but an accidental legend. And yet, would that make the forger's work any less remarkable? Or more? You decide not to answer yourself just yet. Instead, you jot down the question and underline it twice. Open loops are good. They keep the mind leaning forward, even in the soft rhythm of bedtime thoughts. The walk back to the guest house is quiet. No more rain, just that hush that follows it. Your shoes make soft sounds on the wet pavement, and every so often you catch a whiff of something. Ink? Paper? Though you can't be sure. Inside your room, you resist the urge to keep working. Instead, you put the notes aside and simply sit, looking at the small travel lamp on the desk. Its shade is pale yellow. You place a black ink page beneath it and watch as the words take on the faintest hint of blue. It's a simple, almost disappointing trick, and yet it changes everything. The preference you've been tracing, the psychological profile you've been assembling, all might rest on a quirk of perception rather than intention. Or maybe the forger knew exactly how the light would transform his work, turning a practical choice into something that would live in memory as romantic and distinctive. You lean back, letting the question remain unresolved, like a note left unfinished. There's something fitting about that. This whole story is built on what isn't quite known. Outside, the lamplight pools in small golden circles along the road, and for the first time tonight, you feel the edges of sleep tugging at you. Still, you know tomorrow will pull you deeper into the forger's trail, whether that trail is truly blue or not. Morning arrives slow, filtered through a pale gray sky that doesn't seem committed to either rain or sun. You wake to the faint creak of the guest house settling, the kind of sound that feels older than the building itself. The cat from last night has migrated to the foot of your bed, curled into a perfect comma, tail tucked beneath its chin. You slide out carefully, trying not to disturb it, and make your way downstairs. The owner is already at a side table, flipping through a local paper. She glances up, offers a nod, and gestures to a pot of coffee. As you pour a cup, the headline catches your eye. Station renovations to begin this spring. It's the same station where you'd found the blue ink letter, which means the shelves, drawers, and forgotten envelopes might not last the year. A quiet urgency settles in your chest. You might be one of the last to see them in their natural disarray. You step outside, coffee in hand, the air cool and damp. Your plan forms almost immediately. Go back to the station, search more deliberately this time, and maybe, just maybe, find evidence of whether the ink was truly blue or just a trick of light. By the time you arrive, the platform is empty, except for a man in a maintenance jacket sweeping puddles toward the edge. The station master's old office smells exactly as it did before: dust, oil, and a faint trace of mildew. But today, you notice something you missed: a half-broken desk lamp shoved against the wall, its amber glass shade cracked but intact. You crouch to look through it, holding up a scrap of paper from the shelf. The light from the lamp's bulb, still somehow working, hits the paper at an angle, and black ink shifts, almost imperceptibly, into a deep, inky blue. You sit back on your heels, staring at the transformation. It's almost too subtle to trust your eyes, which brings you back to that slippery concept from last night: confirmation bias. Once you believe something, like the forger used blue ink, your mind starts collecting proof, even bending the evidence to fit. If the forger knew this, if he understood how human perception works, then he might have leaned into the illusion deliberately. Leave documents in the right lighting, under amber lamps, and let the brain do the rest. You decide to keep the lamp in mind, but resist taking it. You're not here to strip the scene, just to observe it. Besides, there's a certain poetry in leaving it for the next person to discover, maybe decades from now. On the far wall, another envelope catches your attention, not for its writing, but for its seal. The wax is a pale shade of blue, flecked with gold dust. You run your finger lightly over it, noticing the uneven edges, the faint thumbprint pressed into the side. You remember reading a quirky fact. In the 19th century, blue sealing wax was considered unlucky in some circles, thought to carry bad omens for correspondence. Whether or not the forger knew that, the choice feels almost mischievous. You take another photograph and step out onto the platform, the lamp's amber glow still lingering in your thoughts. By mid-morning, you've moved on to the small local museum. It's really just 2 rooms in the back of the town hall, curated with more love than funding. One corner is dedicated to notable local figures, and sure enough, there's a case for the forger. Inside, under glass, are 3 documents: a forged banknote, a faked letter of reference, and an unfinished will. All are labeled blue ink. You lean closer. Under the museum's bright white lighting, the blue looks suspiciously black. You ask the attendant, a soft-spoken man with glasses perched at the end of his nose, whether these have always looked this way. "Oh no," he says. "They used to be kept in a different case, warmer lights like an old study. People swore the ink was blue then. Funny how light changes what we think we see." It's the same story again. Color as a matter of perception, not fact. And yet, the consistency of this illusion makes it almost feel intentional. You wander through the rest of the exhibit, half listening to your own thoughts. If the forger's most recognizable signature wasn't the ink itself, but the idea of the ink, then his craft was even subtler than you'd imagined. He wasn't just altering paper, he was altering memory, one witness at a time. On your way out, the attendant stops you. "You know," he says, "some say he preferred blue because of his father. Old man ran a shipping company, used blue ink for all his logs, said it reminded him of the sea." You file the detail away without judgment. Whether it's true or just another layer of folklore, it adds to the texture of the man's legend. Experts still debate which stories are fact, which are embellishment, and which were planted by the forger himself. The afternoon drifts into evening as you walk back through town. The clouds finally break, letting a soft golden light spill over the rooftops. For a moment, everything looks gentler, quieter. You pass by the stationery shop yet again, and the French ink bottle is still in its place, glimmering faintly in the sun's angle. You think about buying it, not to use, but to keep as a tangible piece of this chase. But then you remember the museum's display, the lamp in the station office, and the amber light trick. The object isn't the truth. The truth is in the way people see it. You leave it where it is, content to let the story remain slightly out of reach. Back in your room, you open your notebook and write a single line at the top of a fresh page. Maybe the ink was never blue. You underline it once, then close the book without adding anything more. The cat jumps onto the bed as you settle in, curling into its familiar comma shape. You let the day's questions drift to the background, knowing they'll still be there tomorrow. Outside, the night deepens, and the amber glow of the street lamps pools on the wet pavement, turning every shadow into a soft echo of the story you've been chasing. You wake to the sound of rain again, this time a steady, determined downpour that blurs the edges of the world outside. The guest house windows are streaked with thin rivulets, the glass trembling slightly when the wind hits just right. The cat, ever practical, is curled in the chair by the radiator, occasionally flicking its tail in mild annoyance at the noise. You sit at the desk with your coffee, staring at your notebook. The line you wrote last night, "Maybe the ink was never blue," is still there, stark and unapologetic. It feels like both a conclusion and a dare. Your plan for the day shifts. Instead of chasing another physical lead, you decide to chase the mind of the man himself. Not where he lived or what pen he used, but how he thought. The color, the paper, the staging of his work. These were all external signs of an internal process. If you can map that process, maybe you can understand the choice, even if the choice was an illusion. There's a cafe on the corner you haven't tried yet, the kind with slightly mismatched chairs and shelves of donated books. You take the farthest table from the door and spread your papers across it. You start with a psychological concept that's been hovering at the edge of your thoughts for days. Anchoring, the way our minds latch onto an initial piece of information and let it influence every judgment that follows. If the forger's first audience, his earliest victims, so to speak, thought they were looking at blue ink, that initial belief would echo outward. Each retelling, each rumor, would start from that anchor. The actual truth of the pigment would barely matter. You imagine him at his desk, pen poised, aware that the color might not register as he sees it. Maybe he counts on that. Maybe he knows that the story will outlast the fact. A little bell rings as someone enters the cafe. You glance up, and for a strange, flickering moment, you think you recognize the older man from the train days ago, the one who was sketching station layouts in the margin of his newspaper. If it's him, he doesn't look your way. You watch him order tea, settle at a table, and pull out a battered leather portfolio. Curiosity wins. You gather your papers and, with the practiced politeness of a stranger in a small town, ask if you may join him. He smiles faintly and gestures to the chair. His name, he says, is Warren. He used to work in railway logistics, but his hobby has always been the quirks of old paperwork. That phrase alone makes you lean in. When you mention the forger, he nods like it's an old acquaintance. Ah, yes, the blue ink business. My uncle swore he saw the man write in black, plain as anything. But later, under the lamps in the office, the words were ocean blue. We all argued about it for years. You ask whether he thinks it was intentional. Warren chuckles. Oh, entirely. He understood people, knew how we see what we expect. Half the time, you don't need to change the truth. Just tilt the light a little. The idea fits too neatly with what you've been building in your mind. You write it down anyway, word for word, as though having it on paper will make it more real. When Warren leaves, you stay behind, mulling over something he said. That phrase, tilt the light a little, isn't just about illumination. It's about framing, guiding attention without force. The forger wasn't hitting people over the head with deception. He was letting them participate in it, which makes the illusion harder to break. By midday, the rain has eased. You take the long way back through town, passing the post office. The sight of it jogs another thought. Postal inspectors once noted that letters in blue ink tended to be opened and read more slowly than those in black. Some attributed it to legibility. Others thought the color simply felt more personal, less formal. If the forger knew that, it adds yet another layer to his methods. Not only would the ink's supposed color make his documents more memorable, but it might also slow down the scrutiny, giving him time to act before suspicion set in. You file that away as a working theory and continue walking. The rest of the afternoon you spend in the guest house lounge, piecing together your notes into something that feels like a map, not of places, but of influence. The path starts with a lamp in a dim study. It moves to the first mistaken observer, then to the retelling, then to the repetition until the blue ink is an unquestioned fact. Along the way are small nudges. A wax seal, a choice of paper, even the placement of documents in rooms with certain light. The more you look at it, the more it seems less like forgery and more like stagecraft. He wasn't forging reality, he was directing it. Evening arrives slowly, the light outside thinning until the lamps along the street become little islands in the dark. You find yourself standing at the window, looking down at the pavement, shining under their glow. The thought comes softly but insistently. Maybe you've been chasing the wrong thing entirely. The ink was never the point. It was just the most visible part of something deeper, a philosophy almost, about how truth can be bent without breaking. Experts still debate whether the man himself saw it that way, or if it's just the romantic filter of hindsight. Some claim he was nothing more than a skilled opportunist. Others insist he was a kind of artist, working in paper and perception. You let the question stay unanswered. Not all mysteries need closing. In fact, some are better left with a little space for the mind to wander, especially when the rain starts again, softer this time, like it's keeping the night company. You close your notebook, leave the lamp on low, and let your eyes rest. Tomorrow will bring the final stretch of this search, but for now, the sound of rain and the dim golden light are enough. The morning is still, heavy with the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel magnified. You can hear the scrape of your chair legs against the wooden floor, the faint crackle of the guesthouse kettle coming to life in the kitchen. Even the cat seems subdued, watching you from the doorway as if sensing that today is different, an ending of sorts. You've decided that before leaving this town, you'll make one last visit to the station. Not to hunt, not to pull apart drawers or tilt papers under odd light, but to stand in the space where so many threads began. The walk there feels slower than usual, your steps measured against the uneven stones of the street. The rain from last night has left the ground slick, and a faint mist curls in the corners of alleyways. The station appears gradually through the haze, its brick walls darker from the damp, the clock above the entrance ticking away without any urgency. Inside, the air smells the same, dust layered over wood polish, a whisper of old cigarette smoke embedded deep in the floorboards. The maintenance man from before is nowhere in sight. You move to the station master's office and find the lamp still where you left it, the cracked amber glass unchanged. This time, you don't reach for anything. You just stand, letting your eyes wander over the uneven stacks of paper, the way the corners of old envelopes curl like tired leaves. Your gaze catches on the chipped teacup you noticed days ago, still sitting on the desk with a faint ring of dried liquid at its bottom. You imagine the forger here, not hunched in frantic work, but calm, methodical, waiting for ink to dry while the tea cooled beside him. It occurs to you that the true key to his skill wasn't the ink at all. It was patience. The willingness to let perception do its slow, creeping work. Most people rush to be understood. He seemed to trust that misunderstanding would grow stronger if left alone. A core psychological concept floats into your mind: the mere exposure effect, our tendency to develop a preference for things simply because we've been exposed to them repeatedly. Maybe that was his real canvas, not the documents themselves, but the repeated exposure to an idea that his ink was blue. Every retelling, every witness, every museum label built familiarity until the detail became as solid as fact. You sit in the old chair, letting your fingers trace the edge of the desk. The forger might have done the same. You picture him not as a shadowy figure fleeing detection, but as a quiet architect, laying foundations in people's minds and walking away before the structure was even built. The longer you sit there, the more you feel the room itself is part of the illusion. The amber light, the dusty smell, the texture of the air, together they carry the same weight as the ink's supposed color. And you realize with a faint smile that you are no more immune to it than anyone else. After a while, you stand, leave the office, and step onto the platform. A single train sits idling, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. The conductor leans against the rail, watching you with polite curiosity. "Heading out?" he asks. "Soon," you say. "Just saying goodbye." He shrugs, as if goodbyes are an everyday currency here, and returns to his watch. You wander toward the far end of the platform where the light thins and the sound of the town fades. In your pocket is the photograph of the wax-sealed envelope from the other day. You look at it again, the pale blue seal with its flecks of gold, and you find yourself wondering whether it was a deliberate echo of the ink's supposed color or just coincidence. Experts, you know, still debate whether the blue was intentional misdirection or merely a quirk of lighting, preserved by the town's collective imagination. Even now, after all your searching, you don't have the answer. But instead of frustration, you feel something gentler: acceptance. Some puzzles aren't meant to be solved completely. Their power lies in the way they keep your mind circling back, finding new angles. As the train exhales a low, steady hiss, you turn and take in the whole station one last time. The bricks, the iron beams, the waiting benches, each piece now tangled with the story you've carried in your head. You suspect you'll never see them again, but the image will follow you, reshaped by memory until it becomes something else entirely. You start walking back through town, past the museum, past the stationery shop with its still gleaming French ink bottle in the window. You don't go in. Some things are better left as they are, untouched, suspended in their own small stage light. Back at the guest house, you pack slowly, folding clothes around your notebook and photographs. The cat watches from the bed, tail flicking lazily. Outside, the sky is brightening, the last of the mist burning away. Before you leave, you sit at the desk one last time and add a single line beneath yesterday's note. It was never about the ink. You underline it twice, close the book, and slip it into your bag. At the door, the guest house owner hands you a small paper-wrapped parcel. "Something for the road," she says with a smile. Inside, you later discover, is a fountain pen with a tiny vial of blue ink. Whether it's coincidence or a quiet acknowledgement of your stay, you can't decide. As the train pulls away from the station, you watch the town shrink into the distance, the rooftops folding into the landscape. You think about how the forger's story will follow you, not as a solved case, but as a living thing, shifting each time you recall it. And somewhere, in the space between memory and imagination, the ink is still blue. The rhythm of the train fades into the distance, replaced by a softer hum in your thoughts. The story has settled now, like ink drying on the page, and the edges of it blur just enough to feel comfortable. You lean back, wherever you are, and let your shoulders loosen. The chase is over for tonight. No more dusty offices, no more half-lit lamps, no more wondering if the blue was real. Just the quiet after, where the mind can wander without urgency. Outside your own window, maybe there's a faint glow from a street lamp. Maybe it's completely dark, save for the tiny light of your screen. The sound in your room is steady, perhaps a fan's gentle whir, perhaps the silence of the late hour. You let yourself sink into that atmosphere, knowing there's nothing left to solve tonight. The forger's patience, the way he tilted the light just enough, those thoughts linger, but not in a sharp way. They've softened, turned into something almost reassuring. A reminder that not every detail has to be pinned down, and that sometimes mystery is just another word for peace. If this story brought you even a small moment of calm, please subscribe so we can take the next step together each night. And if you want more slow, strange tales to drift off to, you can find an entire bedtime criminal psychology playlist on the channel. It's waiting for you. But most of all, if you've ever lost something small or left a little part of yourself somewhere without meaning to, tell me about it. I read every single comment before I sleep. For now, close your eyes. Let the light fade. The ink will still be there in the morning,